This is John Burns with WHOSAY, and this is The Power of Influence. And today we have an amazing guest. She is a television producer and a novelist, and she has a new book out entitled Victoria, and also a PBS miniseries by the same name. Check out a quick clip now.
I was 13. I was having a history lesson with Lazen. She showed me the family tree, and I looked at it for a long time. And then I realized I was next.
Were you pleased?
I remember thinking my uncle's crown would be too big for me.
Welcome. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I read the book, so I'm very excited for you. So congratulations. We're going to get into this in a little bit. But I want to start at the beginning. As a young girl growing up in the UK, what did you hope to be?
Well, my first ambition was to be Prime Minister.
Well, that's a good goal.
Yeah, and then I realised I probably wasn't cut out for that. Yeah, I think it was ballerina, actress, Prime Minister, and then I came down a bit and thought, well, maybe a writer. Who knows, you know? And now, yeah, look at me, I'm a writer.
Yeah,
Wow.
so you had all those different types of options, but what and who influenced you to pursue writing?
Well, it's really interesting. I had a kind of slightly fractured childhood. My parents divorced when I was very young, when I was about 5. And I lived with my father, not my mother. And I think when you're a sort of quite a solitary child, you find reading can become a huge solace. And so I basically grew up in books. You know, reading was my way of... It's not that I educated myself, but books were my friends. I know that sounds tragic, but that's right.
No,
I didn't actually have many friends, but I did have my books. And so I guess I could have inhabited those stories in a way that, I don't know, later on, it took me a long time to actually have the confidence to sit down and write a novel. It wasn't, in fact, until I was 40. But when I did, it was just like, oh, this is what I've been meant to be doing all my life. You know, it just sort of, it just felt right. It was just amazing.
No, I understand that. And so you mentioned a good point there, getting the confidence to sit down and write. How did you get that confidence? What was the impetus for that?
You know, it's funny, because in like my teens and 20s, I'd sort of sat down and started to write stuff, and then I just thought, oh, this isn't good enough. This isn't good enough. This is no good. I can't do this. And I think there's a point. I remember there's a great quote by Winston Churchill, which is, don't let perfection stand in the way of the good or the very good. Don't let, instead stand in the way of the excellent. So basic, and I think as a young woman, I wanted everything to be perfect.
Right.
And actually, as I got older, I realised it doesn't matter if it's not perfect. So long as it's the best you can do, then that's the thing to go for. So actually, I think it took me, until I got to the age of 40, and I'd been successful in some other things. And I realised, well, I can do this, or I'm going to give it a try, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't matter. But I just found I had that magic thing of sitting down, and I started writing the story, and suddenly when writers say this, you always think, really? But the characters started talking to me in my head, and I don't actually have, this. I am sane. I am sane. And it was like I was sort of not totally in control of what was going to happen next, and I found that so exciting. And I think all writers feel that when you get to that point of flow, where you're so in tune with your story that you feel like you're almost the medium for the story, and it's just coming to you from somewhere you don't quite know where it's happening. That's the most exciting thing. And sometimes I'll go back over stuff I've written. I think, did I write that? Wow, God, I must have been on fire that day.
Very impressed.
Yeah.
But I mean, you say you were kind of acting like a medium. But how do you come with these amazing concepts and these amazing characters?
Well, I guess I've read an awful lot.
Right.
I mean, literally, that's all I did in my childhood. I was like the swot, who was just sitting there reading books. And then I studied history at university, and I was always fascinated by history. I love to know how other people, how people in the past smelt, how they ate, what they thought. Are people, 100, 200 years ago, are people different, or are they actually the same but wear different clothes? Do you know what I mean? And I'm fascinated by that,
really
by that thing. And I was always fascinated by the story of sort of strong women in history, queens, princesses, all of that. And I grew up reading all these kind of historical novels and, watching shows about Elizabeth I and all the rest of it. And as a student, I started reading about Queen Victoria. And I started reading her diaries. And it was the most amazing thing because, I'd imagined Queen Victoria to be this kind of, woman dressed in black, scowling at the world. But actually, I read her diaries when she was like 19 years old, and she's this kind of party princess. You know, she's having a great time. She loves music. She loves dancing. She loves her dog. She really, really likes men. And there's this hilarious quote I found in her diaries, which kind of crystallized Victoria for me. She's just got engaged to Prince Albert, and they've gone for a ride, and they come back, and she goes, oh, "My dearest Albert, he was wearing these white cashmere pantaloons with nothing underneath." And I was just like, whoa, this is amazing, because that makes you feel that could have been written by any teenage girl today.
It's very relatable, and I'm glad you brought that up too, because I mean, we're obviously talking about the book Victoria, which is amazing, so congratulations again.
You.
And you talk from the context of 19th century historical fiction. Why do you think that's so popular? What really brought you to really enjoy not only reading it, but writing it as well?
Well, I think it's because it's a world where there are rules, you know, and I think what's sort of, you know, because in those days, you know, there are lots of constraints, you know. If you're a well-brought-up young lady, you can't be in the same room as a man alone, and you know. So if you're writing it, it gives you lots of things to work around, because you know, when you want drama, you need lots of obstacles to make it work, sort of thing.
Right.
And I think we like the 19th century because it's a time when everything's changing, and where the position of women is, you know, at the beginning of the century they're not allowed to vote. By the end of it, they're beginning to come through, and they're finding themselves, you know, suddenly women are taking their rightful place in the world. So that's very exciting, I think. And I don't know, the 19th century is just like, it's a lot of my favourite books are written in the 19th century, you know, Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre, you know, Wuthering Heights, or Dickens, all these great, great books. And so I suppose I've just steeped myself in the 19th century. So when I came to write, it was just, there was only one place to go, really.
Yeah, no, it's a great book, obviously, and a great era to write about. And you talked about the challenges that women faced during that time and what they overcame during that time too. And I remember you had a great quote, and I want to read it to make sure I get it exact, when talking about not only the book but also the PBS special as well. And you said, you quoted saying, "It's about a concept so modern that it still frightens people, a young woman in power." First of all, what issues resonate with you today that made you say that? And what can we do as a community, and what can you do with your power of influence and your platform right now to make sure we push agendas forward that really enable women to feel empowered and to be self-resilient?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, it was very interesting. The first interview I did about Victoria, I was in England, and the show was being filmed, and a guy came up from the Telegraph, which is a very right-wing British paper. And he said to me, "So, is your version of Victoria a feminist one?" And I was going, what do you mean by that? I was sort of puzzled by the question, because, you know, I didn't really have an agenda. I'm a writer. I'm not a...
Right.
But I realised what he actually meant was that it's a show with a young woman at its heart. And for him, that was enough to make it a feminist agenda. And I just suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I'm taking for granted something that other people find really weird, the idea that you would have, you know. And it's quite interesting, there are very few shows, if you think about it, that have a young woman at its heart. Not a young woman, you know. I mean, you'll have something like Gossip Girl, where there are girls, you know, there's a group of young women and it's all about boys and girls and whatever, but a young woman who's also a young woman in power, you know, who has status unrelated to her romantic interests, that is really, really unusual. That's really modern. And, you know the thing about the Bechdel test, and, you know, whether a film passes the Bechdel test.
Yes.
Well, I realised without even really thinking about it, the thing about Victoria is that every scene passes the Bechdel test, because it's all about her. The idea that it's about a young woman, and it's not about, I mean, of course, you know, part of the plot is about whether she gets married or not, but it's actually about how a young woman deals with power. I think that's really interesting. And I hope, and I've seen actually some evidence of this in England, that I think that it's very, very popular in England with teenage girls, with young women, basically, who love the show, because, you know, there are very few role models for them out there.
Interesting.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, here's a girl whose whole life is not just about whether she looks good or putting herself on Instagram or what her weight is or any of that. She's not valued for her looks. She's valued for the fact that she's the Queen of England. She's the head of state.
Right.
And that is a really kind of, that's something that people have to get their heads around, because yes, if you live in England, you're used to seeing the Queen, but the Queen is old, you know, she's in her 90s.
Right, yeah,
and the
of course.
idea that an 18-year-old could be Queen is a really sort of powerful, inspiring concept. And what I've tried to do with Victoria is to show that she comes to the throne and everybody thinks because she's 18 and because she's tiny, she's only 5 foot, that everyone thinks they can push her around. Everybody thinks, oh, no problem, we'll make her into, we'll be able to mould her, we'll be able to tell her what to do. But what I've tried to show is that right from the get-go, she says, no, hang on, guys, I'm going to do things my way. And she asserts herself, and I think shows such strength of character. She asserts herself against all these old men in the most sort of astonishing way. Not always wisely, but that doesn't really matter, because what I think is so important is that she's asserting herself and she makes mistakes. She's not perfect, but she carries on. And I think that's such an empowering message for young women, because, you know, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to kind of get things right all the time. You know, it's like me, self-censoring all those years ago. You don't have to get things right, but the important thing is to be who you are. Don't be who somebody else wants you to be who you want to be.
Right.
And that's what I think Victoria does, and that's why I think she's so interesting. So, like, one of the things I find fascinating about Victoria is that she, I mean, to use a modern term, she creates her own brand because she chooses her own name. So Victoria wasn't called Victoria growing up, she's called Drina, Alexandrina. And she says, no, I don't like that name. I don't want to be called Elizabeth or Charlotte, but I think I'm going to choose my own name. I'm going to choose this really weird name that nobody else in the country is called, because it's an anglicisation of a French name, Victoria. There is no other Victoria in the country at this point. So imagine, it's like someone saying, I'm Queen Beyonce, okay? It's a made-up name, all right? And she said, I'm going to call myself Victoria. And I think, subconsciously, the reason she chooses that name is because it's about winning, victory, Victoria.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah,
well, that brings me to my next question then. What do you want the readers or the viewers of the PBS series to take from Victoria? Do you want to take the sense of empowerment from the character or the person actually that did exist? What do you want, what emotion do you want to be evoked from the reader or the viewer?
I suppose I'm speaking a little bit to my teenage self. I want people to read the book and think, well, it's okay, you know, to be powerful. Actually, it's okay for a young woman to be powerful, that you don't, you know, there are other forms of power than just looking good or being attractive to men or whatever. You can be yourself and you can assert yourself, and that's okay. You can make mistakes, and that's okay. And it doesn't matter if people say that you're bossy or feisty or whatever it is. It's okay. You go for it, because actually the most important thing you can do is to be yourself. So I hope that's what people take away from it. I don't think I'm a writer with a message. But I think it's very important to give young women, you know, the confidence.
Absolutely.
I have a teenage daughter, and I see her, and she's, you know, she's got a lot of spirit, but, you know, there are days when she goes, oh, you know, I can't go on, nobody loves me. And I just wanted her to feel, it's okay, you know, we all feel like that, but you've got to carry on, and you've got to be yourself. And you've got to do the best that you can, and don't worry if things aren't perfect. You know, I do think perfection, you know, Queen Victoria, thank God, didn't have Instagram, so she never had to worry about that. But, you know, things really don't have to be perfect, but so long as you believe in what you're doing, you know, that's all you can hope for, really.
And even though you probably wasn't intended, I think it's such a powerful message, especially now, in the climate that we're living in now, a very divisive climate. I think it's important to convey these messages of empowerment and just self-esteem and confidence. So thank you for that. What's next? Is there a story that you haven't wrote that you want to write?
Oh my goodness, so there are lots. At the moment I'm writing season 2 of Victoria. And if it's possible, another novel. And yeah, there are stories. I would love to write a story about the 1970s. I've got a great idea for a story set in the 1970s.
Oh, okay.
You know, which is a miles away from corsets and bustles, but I think it's maybe time I got into the 20th century, so I'm excited about that.
Okay, good. And in terms of like sounding boards, do you throw ideas off of friends or family?
Always, yeah.
Okay.
I do. Yeah. And if they go, you just go. But sometimes you just have to stick to your guns. That's the other thing I would say.
Yeah.
You have to stick to your guns, because it's very easy to be, you know, I stopped showing anything to my husband years ago because he would go, yeah, or he'd sort of nod off who was reading it, and I was just thinking, oh, this is my baby. But, you know, don't show stuff to your partner.
Okay,
you know,
okay.
it's just not a good idea.
That's okay.
You
That's
know,
understandable.
it puts a strain on your marriage, is all I can say. So you've got to find somebody who you really trust, who's going to give you really good feedback, who has, you know, who isn't going to be too honest, you know,
Right,
because great ideas can be killed too early, you know. And if you really come back to an idea and it's really sort of marinating in your subconscious, the chances are that it's going to work. Because, you know, with Victoria, you know, I first sort of started thinking about Victoria when I was a student, and now 30 years later I'm writing about her, you know. So I think everything is material, and you never know quite what it's going to be until you start doing it. And I'm just a great believer in, you know, show up, sit down, start writing, and somehow something will happen. You know, the magic is there. You just have to kind of wait for it. I mean, I know that sounds a bit kind of new age, but I know it's true.
I love that. The magic is there. You just might have to wait for it.
Yeah, I mean, it just, and the only way you get to it is if you keep writing.
Right.
Because even though it's hard and it's painful, the long, you know, it's like when you're running, not that I do much running, but sometimes there comes a point where it stops being painful and you're actually enjoying it. It's the same with writing.
Right.
You know, the beginning is hard, and then suddenly it gets
a little bit easier.
Yeah.
You keep moving.
And suddenly you're flying, and then that's the best feeling in the world. That's the reason I write, not for the, you know, the results. It's just the few moments that you get when you're sitting at your laptop and you're suddenly so into it that, you know, you don't care whether it's dark outside or what's going on around you. When that happens, that's like the best drug in the world.
Right. Well, you're in the zone. Continue to write,
Thank
continue
you.
to produce, continue to share your works with the world. Thank you so much, Daisy Goodwin. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Oh, so lovely to talk to you.
All right, thank you. And make sure you guys go get her book and watch the PBS series as well.